once again for my choice of the 12 best games of chess ever played. With me is the celebrated author and journalist Donald Woods, welcome Donald, who will be joining me later to comment on this week's game. Last week we profiled the great Boris Spassky and promised you an in-depth look at the Fischer-Spassky match of Reykjavik 1972, a major landmark in chess history, attracting more media coverage than any previous chess match anywhere. The reason, of course, was the presence of Bobby Fischer, one of the most controversial figures in the history of chess. Bobby Fischer was born in Brooklyn in 1943. His rise to the top was meteoric, marking him out as one of the supreme chess prodigies of all time. By the age of 15, he was a world championship candidate. But his first two attempts at the chess crown, in 1959 and 1962, foundered when he went down to the legions of Russian grandmasters in the candidates' tournaments. Then, in 1970, Fischer's fortune changed. The qualifying cycle for the World Championship had been switched from a tournament to a match system, and Fischer powered his way through to a challenge against Spassky by demolishing Taimanov, Larsen and Petrosyan, beating the first two by an astounding 6-0 win. Then came the grand climax, the match in Reykjavik 1972 against Boris Spassky. Inevitably, a clash between representatives of Russian and American might became overladen with symbolic and political overtones, which attracted the glare of the world media. This glare was fueled by Fischer's strange series of antics, and the match was characterized by the Americans' detailed demands and his near refusal to play before the match was even underway. The game I have chosen was instrumental in deciding the outcome of the 1972 World Championship match. So, Donald, Fischer played white, Spassky black, and Fischer kicked off with the move c4, the English opening. But as we'll soon see, there was a rapid transposition to our old friend. Here it comes.
Queen's Gambit.
Queen's Gambit, that's right. Knight f6, knight c3, and Spassky played bishop e7, the tried and tested orthodox defence to the Queen's Gambit, which of course we saw as well in the game between Bernstein and Capablanca,
Right.
from Moscow 1914. Spassky castled his king into safety, and Fischer played this move, bringing out his bishop, and now Spassky attacked the bishop. And in many games between Kasparov and Karpov, we now see the move bishop takes knight on f6. It's the modern try, the latest try in this position to give white an advantage.
I'm glad to hear that, Ray, because I'd zap that knight every time. But I noticed in most cases it seems to be the bishop goes to h4 and then g3.
That's right, that's what happened in this game. Fischer dropped the bishop back, and of course, as you say, Donald, the bishop could go to g3 to menace the black queen's wing, or it can stay on h4, and perhaps at a later stage, a more opportune moment, he can play bishop takes knight on f6. Well, now Spassky played this move. It's called, and this is a mouthful, the Tartakova-Merkoganov-Bondarevsky variation. I'll repeat that, Tartakova-Merkoganov-Bondarevsky.
It's magnificent.
And Bondarevsky was one of Spassky's trainers, and he picked it up from the two older masters, Tartakova and Merkoganov. And it's one of black's most solid defences in the Queen's Gambit. In fact, there's an ongoing debate as to how white should properly react against this. How does white get an advantage? For example, this move has been seen against it. Some people play the bishop to e2. Some people put the queen on b3. And yet again, others have been known to play bishop takes f6 now, once black's committed himself to the pawn move on the queen side. But in 1972, the fashionable move was to take this pawn off. And now we see the point of black's defence. He can take back with the knight on d5. And this alleviates a lot of his cramp, a lot of his development difficulties. The exchanges help to free the black position. And now Fischer could play the bishop back to g3, it's possible, but then there could be an annoying pin like this. So he doesn't do that. He trades bishops on e7. And Capablanca once had this position, and he took with the knight. But it's a little bit passive. There's no need to do that. It's better to keep the knight on d5.
Take with the queen.
Yes, exactly. The main line is to take on e7 with the queen. And now Fischer decides to fix the central pawn formation. He trades knights. Black must take back. And now a key move, rook across to c1. And you'll see, Donald, that the black pawn on c7 is a weakness. Not a serious weakness yet, it's a potential weakness. It's a backward pawn on an open file. And if white can gang up on this pawn, perhaps with moves like queen c2, he's going to get the advantage. So black has to take measures against this. Now, let me ask you an unfair question.
Shoot. Ask away.
It's black's move. He should move his bishop. He should develop the bishop. Where would you put it?
I'd fianchetto.
And
even as I say it, I'm guessing that that's probably not what happened.
Yeah, it's the natural move, because you play b6, you expect he who says b6 must say bishop b7.
Yes.
But in fact, on b7, you'll see it on the diagram now, the pawn on d5 restricts the bishop.
Yes.
Given the chance, black plays better bishop e6.
e6, yeah.
The pawn on d5 still restricts the bishop, but at least it has chances later on perhaps to go to f5, or even g4,
yes,
with more active counterplay.
I'll bear that in mind next time, right?
And now we see a very nice move by Fischer. Queen out to a4. And the threat of this move, apart from the general pressure that it puts on the black queen side, the strain it imposes on the black pieces in that area, it's supporting this move precisely. It's supporting the move b2 to b4, which puts a clamp on the black pawn in the c file. The pawn on b4, the pawn on d4 are like twin horns squeezing black in and making it impossible for him ever to free his game by playing a move like c5.
Ray, this is the sort of thing I notice about Bobby Fischer's play. As far as ordinary players like myself are concerned, there's such a beautiful simplicity to it. That's probably not the right word, but it's an apparent simplicity. And I'm aware, as I say that to people of your level, you can see deeper profundities in his play, which are not apparent to us. But is it not true that Bobby Fischer's play is characterized by, it's the simplicity of a Bach fugue? Once you hear it, you think, well, the notes couldn't have gone anywhere else. And that's what his play always looks like to me.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It looks, when Fischer's playing, that each move is dreadfully simple.
Yes.
And yet these simple moves add up to a cumulative crushing effect. And queen a4 is a fairly unpretentious move, but it has a much deeper point, as we'll see in a minute. And what Spassky plays quite reasonably is pawn to c5. And you'll remember, Donald, in the Bernstein-Capablanca game we saw a few weeks ago, that when Capablanca achieved this move c5, I said, well, his position's liberated, his problems are over, and the game is equal. But here, because of Fischer's subtle play, this isn't quite the case. Even after this liberating thrust, the positions still aren't quite level. And now we see, really, the subtle hidden point behind the move queen to a4, this move that looked like just a sort of general pressing move on the queen side with the fairly transparent threat of playing the pawn from b2 to b4. What he does is he puts the queen back on a3.
What I call a sassy pin.
A sassy pin.
Yes.
And this is a dreadfully important move because the queen on a3 exerts a baleful influence right through the black position from a3 down to f8. The pawn on c5 is, of course, pinned. It can't take on d4. The black queen on e7 hangs. And there's now tremendous pressure against the pawn on c5. Now, black could play his knight to d7 to diffuse this, but then white plays bishop b5, increasing the pressure, and also threatening in some circumstances just to lop off the knight.
That's what I would have done.
So, knight d7 doesn't really solve the problem.
The reason I would have done that, and I think, again, most club players, is we've got this fixation about getting your rooks connected. you know, almost to a fault.
Yeah.
And therefore get that knight off there, get him working in another direction.
Spassky played better. He played this rook c8. And Fischer now played another very subtle move, bishop b5. Of course, it's natural when the black knight's on d7. It's not so natural
Yes.
when the knight isn't there yet. And now, Spassky makes his first mistake. He plays a6. Now, this has a kind of threat against the white bishop, but it's not a serious threat.
Can't
If he takes
take
the
it
bishop,
really, yes.
it's pinned to the rook.
Yes.
The queen pins the pawn to the rook. After a year of intensive analysis, the Soviet analytical machine discovered that the right move in this position is queen to b7, simply sacrificing the pawn on c5. And they discovered that after the pawn is taken, after the sacrifice, black gets sufficient compensation and can make a draw. But
Well, if it took them a year, it wouldn't take if you know, a short match like that.
That's right. I mean, it took their best brains a year to find this, and of course poor Spassky had to confront this problem over the board. And it's not surprising that he makes an inferior move, a natural move, but an inferior one. And Fischer takes off. Spassky has to take back, and Fischer castles. And now rook a7. And what he's trying to do is to defend the rook. The queen on e7 now defends the rook on a7.
Oh, so he can, yes.
So the threat of a takes b5
Yes.
becomes real.
Right.
Fischer has to move his bishop away. He moves it back to e2. And at last the knight is developed. But now Fischer has a wonderful move. He plays knight to d4.
Yeah.
And of course it can't be taken. If pawn takes knight,
So,
then you take
yes.
the black queen. Queen takes
Yeah.
queen on e7. That's clear. Spassky moved his queen back to defend it. But now we see the point of Fischer's very fine play. He takes off the bishop on the e6 square, and Spassky takes back. Now it looks as if, perhaps, black is okay here. He's got quite a solid pawn centre. His pieces are fairly well coordinated. But white has two important advantages. One is the bishop on e2 is superior to the knight in an open position. It's infinitesimally superior. The advantage is minute, but a minute advantage in Fischer's hands can be a mighty bludgeon in the later part of the game. The other advantage white has is he has two sets of pawns, two pawn islands, one set on the queen side, one set on the king side. Black has three islands of pawns, the king side, the centre, and the queen side. And this split formation is a disadvantage, and Fischer exposes both of these in magnificent fashion. And first of all, he punches a hole in the centre. He offers a pawn sacrifice. Black could take it, but then his position's a terrible wreck. Pawns are scattered everywhere. It's as if a hurricane's blown through his position. And white would get the pawn back very quickly anyway. He would simply attack the pawn on e4, and it would fall very soon. Black can't consider that. Spassky sensibly played his pawn on to d4. And that actually creates a protected passed pawn in the middle of the board, which is quite a considerable plus. The trouble is Spassky can never push the pawn any further. The white bishop on e2, and white's general control of the light squares, Donald, is stopping that pawn ever from advancing. So it's a somewhat negative trump.
And e6 is starting to look a bit sick.
Exactly, exactly. And what Fischer does now, if black could play this move, for example, at no cost to himself and fortify the centre, he might be all right. But Fischer now takes pains to lock in the black e pawn on e6. He starts to besiege it.
Threat later from the bishop.
That's right.
I'm starting to learn, Ray. We must do this more often. You know, I could learn something about this game.
The queen comes up. And now, again, Spassky's threatening to play this, which he couldn't do the previous move, because when white took it, the rook attacked the queen. And just in time, everything's always just in time in Fischer's games. You noticed that, Donald?
Yes.
It's always just in time. He fixes the e-pawn as a weakness. Spassky tries to get counterplay on the open b file. But now the real siege starts. Bishop to c4, attacking the e6 pawn. And the threat, of course, is to push on this pawn, exploiting the pin. So the king steps out of the firing line. And now a wonderful move, beautiful move. The queen sweeps over from one extreme edge of the board to the other. A3 to H3. Double attack against the pawn on E6. There's very little choice. The knight has to go back to F8. And now a little safety move on the queen side, stopping black from taking the pawn with the rook. And now black literally has run out of sensible moves. He's got nothing sensible to do at all. What he did was, he pushed this pawn. Doesn't really have much effect. And Fischer transmuted the advantage of the pressure against E6 by this next very fine move into the advantage of a passed pawn. Spassky can't allow this to happen. He must take it off. Pawn takes pawn. And now up comes the rook. Rook takes. The knight goes into H7. And the other rook comes over. And now the two rooks, the bishop...
He's got four pieces powerfully involved.
That's right. Spassky is really just marking time. Queen to D8. And the queen comes over, preparing to advance the kingside pawns. Rook goes into E7. And up comes this pawn, restricting the black knight. And this move. Really, again, just marking time. And finally, this move, pawn to E6. And this passed pawn on E6 is now like a fishbone rammed into Spassky's throat. All he can do is move round it. He can't really do anything about it at all. And in the wake of the passed pawn, up comes the queen. Queen to E5. Spassky waits. Queen goes to E8. And Fischer locks out the remotest chance of counterplay. Spassky marking time again. Really nothing he can do. And now Fischer marks time a bit himself. This move isn't strictly necessary.
Yes, I was wondering why. Why there particularly?
Yes, he's waiting to find the right plan. And then the next move, he finds the right plan and brings the rook up here. There's nothing Spassky can do about this. His pieces are on the best defensive squares. He just has to wait to see what happens. And now the bishop realigns itself, pointing at the black king side. The queen goes back to E8 again. And now queen to E4. And you can see devilish intentions. Absolutely devilish intentions.
Even I can see that.
Yes, I mean, one threat is to put the rook here check. And then after it captures on F8, queen H7 will be mate.
Yes.
It's a horrible threat.
Or even F7, should I?
Even F7 as well. He played knight to F6. And now the crowning glory of this wonderful game, this game that's been likened to a Mozart symphony by grandmasters on the spot. He just breaks through the defensive wall by playing rook takes knight on F6. Black must take back. And down come the barricades around the black king. Rook takes F6. King goes to G8. There's really very little he can do. And I think Spassky was very short of time now as well. The bishop goes into C4. He marks time again. And then the final move, after the time control, queen to F4. And really, hopeless position now. White has bishop and pawn for the exchange, for the rook, and black's nothing he can do at all. Spassky resigned in this position.
Brilliant stuff.
I mean, for example, if he plays king here, white takes his pawn with the queen, and then he comes here, for example, and then finally, in comes the bishop, check, and black's completely destroyed, absolutely hopeless. And if the rook goes here to stop it, then this is checkmate. Wonderful game.
Powerful that bishop ended up being, isn't it?
Yes.
There's always the threat. Yeah, a wonderful game.
Right.
But virtually all these games are like that, aren't they?
Yes, it is. Wonderful. Perhaps the Western media exposure helped to knock the stuffing out of Spassky. After 1972, chess enthusiasts witnessed an amazing and unexpectedly permanent decline in his morale. He never staged a comeback and was granted permission to represent Soviet culture abroad by joining his French-born third wife, Marina, in her homeland. Strangely, the 1972 match had an even more disastrous impact in chess terms on its victor. You wouldn't have guessed it at the time, though. This is Fischer being interviewed after his return to the States.
Do you think that In trying to sort of get better facilities, you've been instrumental in getting a record person, this sort of thing. Has it purely been personal gain, or has it really been to upgrade the whole game of chess, as far as you're concerned?
It's been basically to upgrade the game, and to make it, I mean, personal gain. I haven't been, if I were interested in personal gain, I wouldn't just be taking up chess.
You'd have applied your brain to something else, would you?
Yeah, I would be in the stock market. That's where the personal gain is at.
What do you intend to do now?
I want to keep playing a lot of chess.
Yeah, quite. But what's your next target? Do you think there'll be a return game with Spassky soon, for example?
Definitely, I want to play a return match. It's a question of the money, A, and B, it's a question of will the Russians let Spassky play, and then I guess C, does he want to play me?
The big addition to the purse, the £50,000, came from London, from an Englishman. Is it likely you'd consider playing the return match in England?
It's a possibility. I mean, I wouldn't close the door in any place.
It doesn't worry you particularly where it is?
No, I think the States would be a good place for the next match. Because, believe it or not, I mean, that's where they got the facilities for TV and everything. You do it right without, creating a fuss.
How do you rate Spassky now? I mean, what are the chances, do you think, of your holding on again in a return match with Spassky?
Oh, I think I'll beat him, much more easily. There's no question about it in my mind.
This is really because you...
I've broken him.
This is what you really set out to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
How would you rate him compared with other players you've played against?
The best, definitely. He gave me a real fight. All the other players I played, they crumbled at a certain stage, and I never felt that, with Spassky.
He never played another competitive game. Donald, would you care to speculate on the reasons for this?
It's one of the great mysteries of the game, isn't it? What makes this genius suddenly abandon chess? I don't know, maybe he felt that having become world champion, he couldn't scale the heights again. Or, on the other hand, you'd imagine that with such a competitive player, he'd want to show how much further he could exceed world championship record performances. I mean, was he not the highest rated player in chess history until Kasparov?
At that time, yes, of course. And in that interview that we just saw, he looked supremely confident and very aggressive.
Yeah.
And my personal thinking is that having scaled the chess Everest, as it were, and become world champion and achieved his ambition, he felt that playing any other game of chess under any circumstances would somehow infringe his status, that even if he lost a game or drew a game against Joe Bloggs in a simultaneous display, this would somehow take away from his status as the greatest player ever.
Well, to put it at its gentlest, that is a very peculiar mental attitude and a great loss for the game of chess.
Yes, and of course this is just speculation. I don't really know what the reasons are, but it's...
Did you ever play him, right?
I never played him, no. I watched him play at very close quarters a number of times. And once I shared a lift with him in the Olympics at Havana in 1966. But wouldn't it be marvellous if we could see Fischer come back someday and play against Karpov and Kasparov?
That would be great.
I mean, this is, I think, the dream of every chess player, that this would happen. I'm just thinking of the games that Fischer and Kasparov would play.
Be a good challenge for Thames Television.
It would
Get
indeed.
Bobby Fischer back into chess.
Yeah. Anyway, as we now know, in spite of regular attempts to attract him back into tournament chess, Fischer has remained an obstinate recluse. But the beneficiaries of Fischer's success in popularising the game and in raising world title purses to astronomical heights were the two great Russians, Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. Between them, they dominated the 1980s. Join us next week to see the most important game in their marathon battle for world chessboard supremacy. Till then, it's goodbye from Donald, myself, and the Thames chess team.